The first thing I noticed at my husband's burial was the empty space where my family was supposed to be. 3 chairs had been set aside near the front for my mother, my father, and my younger sister Sarah. I kept looking at them, even after I knew they weren't coming, as if staring long enough might somehow make one of them appear. Tamsin stood beside me with one hand wrapped around my arm. She had been my best friend since college, and she had spent the previous 4 days doing things I couldn't seem to make myself do. Answering calls, bringing food, finding the black dress I was wearing, because I had stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes without remembering why I had opened it. "You don't have to keep looking at those seats, Ellie," she whispered. I nodded, but I looked anyway. That was the thing about disappointment. Sometimes you could know exactly what was coming and still find a way to be surprised when it arrived. My name is Aloan Hartley. I was 32 years old when my husband, Graham, died, and until that week I had spent most of my life believing that being the dependable person in a family eventually earned you something. Respect, maybe. Loyalty. At the very least. I thought it meant people would show up when it was finally your turn to need them. Graham had never believed that. Not about my family. He used to tell me that my mother had turned the phrase, "You're the strong one," into a permission slip to ask more from me than anyone else. I always defended her. I defended all of them. My mother, Celeste, my father, Martin, my sister, Seraphina, although everyone called her Sarah. Graham would watch me leave a family dinner after agreeing to help Sarah move, redesign a room in her apartment for free, cover for her when she forgot our father's birthday, or drive 40 minutes because my mother had decided some small crisis needed immediate attention. Then he would ask me the same question. Do they ever call you when they don't need something? I hated that question because I never had a good answer. Graham wasn't cruel about it. That almost made it worse. He never told me to cut them off. He never tried to make me choose between him and them. He just noticed things I had trained myself not to notice. Once, after my mother called during our anniversary dinner because Sarah was upset about a fight with a boyfriend, I apologized to Graham for the 3rd time while reaching for my coat. He took my hand and said, "Being the strong one doesn't mean you owe everyone the pieces they refuse to carry themselves." I stayed at dinner that night. My mother didn't speak to me for 3 days. Graham bought me dessert anyway. That was who he was. Quietly stubborn about the people he loved. We had been married for 7 years. He managed operations for a small property development company, and I worked as an interior space planner, mostly on offices, studios, and retail spaces. We weren't wealthy, we weren't glamorous. We had a comfortable townhouse, an unreasonable number of coffee mugs, and a running argument about whether the thermostat should ever go below 70. Graham always won that argument by pretending not to touch the thermostat while touching the thermostat. The morning everything changed was ordinary enough that I still resent it for pretending to be. Graham made coffee. I complained that he had used the last of the oat milk. He told me that sounded like a problem for future Aloan. I told him future Aloan was married to an inconsiderate man. He kissed my forehead and left for an early meeting. By lunchtime, I was sitting in a hospital waiting area, trying to understand words that seemed to arrive in the wrong order. Medical emergency. Sudden. They tried. They were sorry. I remember staring at the doctor's shoes because looking at his face made everything feel too real. I kept waiting for someone to tell me there was another step, another room, another form, another person who could change what had happened. There wasn't. By evening, Tamsin was with me. By midnight, Graham's brother had called from another state and booked the first flight he could find. The next morning, I called my mother. I thought that call would be the moment my family finally became the people I had always told myself they were. My mother answered on the second ring. I got through the sentence somehow. Graham died yesterday. There was silence. Then she said my name softly, and for about 5 seconds, I felt relief. She asked what happened. I told her what little I understood. She said it was terrible. My father got on the phone and told me he was sorry. Then my mother asked when the burial would be. Saturday, I said. Another silence. This one felt different. This Saturday? She asked. I remember pulling the phone away from my ear and looking at it. Yes, Mom, this Saturday, she sighed. Not a grief sigh, an inconvenient sigh. Helloan? That's Sarah's grand opening. Sarah had spent the better part of a year preparing to open a boutique she called Veil and Vine. My parents had invested heavily in it, financially and emotionally. My mother talked about the grand opening like Sarah was cutting a ribbon at the United Nations. I know, I said. But this is when Graham's family can be here. Would it really make a difference if you waited a few more days? She asked. I felt something inside me go completely still. Yes, I said. It would make a difference to me. My father murmured something in the background. My mother lowered her voice. Nobody is saying it isn't important, Eloan. We're just trying to be practical. Practical? I ended the call before I said something I couldn't take back. An hour later, the family group chat started. Sarah wrote first. She said she understood I was upset, but people had booked travel, vendors were scheduled, and local influencers had already confirmed. I replied once. I'm burying my husband on Saturday. Sarah responded almost immediately. And I'm sorry, but everyone has been planning this for months. We can't rearrange everything over one trivial event. I read the message 3 times. Then I waited for my mother to correct her. She didn't. Celeste wrote, "Let's all calm down." My father said nothing. I turned my phone face down and stared at the kitchen table Graham and I had bought together 2 years earlier. That was when I understood they were actually going to choose her. Again, only this time. There was no way for me to pretend the choice didn't matter. Saturday came. Sarah opened her boutique. My parents stood beside her for photographs. I buried my husband. Graham's co-workers came, old friends came. Clients I had never met came because he had helped them solve some problem years earlier, and they had never forgotten it. Tamsin never left my side. Adrian Cross, a man Graham had worked with on a community project, drove nearly 3 hours to be there. The 3 chairs reserved for my family stayed empty. Afterward, I went home and turned my phone off. For the next 2 weeks, none of them came to see me. Then, on a Tuesday morning, my mother finally called. For one stupid second, I thought maybe she was calling to ask how I was sleeping, or whether I had eaten, or whether I needed help sorting through Graham's things. Instead, after less than a minute of small talk, she said, "Helloan, we need to discuss what you're planning to do with Graham's commercial building." And that was the moment I realized my family had not come back because they missed me. They had come back because, once again, I had something Sarah needed. My mother said Graham's commercial building, the way someone might talk about a spare couch taking up too much room. I sat at my kitchen table with one hand around a mug of coffee I had forgotten to drink and tried to understand how we had moved from my husband being gone to discussing his property in less than 3 weeks. "I haven't decided what I'm doing with it," I said. Celeste gave a small sigh. "That's exactly why we should talk now, before you make an emotional decision." There it was again, the idea that grief had made me unreliable while somehow making everyone else more qualified to decide what should happen to the things Graham left behind. The building was a narrow 2-story commercial property in an older business district about 20 minutes from where we lived. Graham had bought into it with a former colleague years earlier, then eventually purchased the remaining share. The ground floor had once been divided into small retail units, while the upper floor had open studio space and several offices. Graham and I had talked about renovating it eventually, but we had never settled on one idea. Sometimes we imagined renting it to small businesses. Sometimes we talked about turning part of it into shared creative space. It had always been one of those future projects we assumed we had years to figure out. Now my mother was speaking about it like an unused family asset waiting for reassignment. "Sarah's current lease is killing her," she said. "The rent is much higher than she expected. and the foot traffic hasn't been what everyone promised. I stared at the wall across from me. What does that have to do with Graham's building? Don't be difficult, Eloan. Her tone sharpened immediately. The first floor would be perfect for the boutique. You know that? I did know that. I had helped review Sarah's original boutique layout before she opened. For free, of course. The building Graham left behind had better visibility, more parking, and enough space for Sarah to expand without paying the kind of rent she was currently paying. I also knew my mother had already thought this through long before calling me. How are you asking me to rent it to her? I asked. Rent is such an ugly way to talk about this right now, Celeste said. I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because sometimes the only response left when someone says something absurd enough is disbelief. It's a commercial property, Mom. Rent is usually involved. She paused. We were thinking something symbolic, just until Sarah gets stable. Why? Your father and I, and Sarah, obviously, I closed my eyes. No. The word came out before I had time to soften it. My mother went quiet. I had spent 32 years learning how to wrap every refusal in apology, explanation, and reassurance. Apparently grief had stripped me of the energy required for packaging. Excuse me? I said no. I don't know what I'm doing with the building yet, and I'm not giving it to Sarah for free. Nobody said free. You said symbolic. Eloan, you are sitting on something that could save your sister. I looked down at my wedding ring. I'm sitting in the house I shared with my husband 3 weeks after he died, listening to you tell me my first responsibility is saving Sarah's boutique. My mother's voice changed, softer now, more wounded. It was one of her most effective tools. That is not what I said. It was exactly what she had said, just rearranged into words she could deny later. I ended the call without agreeing to anything. By that evening, Sarah was calling me directly. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but some old reflex made me answer. I don't understand why you're making this so complicated, she said after less than 2 minutes. There was no real condolence before that. No mention of Graham except in relation to what he owned. She explained the boutique's numbers as though I were an investor who had demanded a quarterly report. Sales were decent, she said, but not enough to cover the rent, staffing, inventory, and marketing. My parents had already put in more money than planned. Moving into Graham's building would cut one of her biggest expenses. You know the space would work, she said. You literally design spaces like that for a living. That doesn't make it yours. I never said it was mine. Then why are we having this conversation? She exhaled loudly. Because family helps family. I actually looked at the phone this time, the same way I had when my mother asked me to move Graham's burial. You missed my husband's burial for a store opening, Sarah. We've been over this. No. You decided we were over it. That's different. She went quiet for a moment, then said, You're using what happened to punish me. I felt my hand tighten around the phone. I am not punishing you. I am saying no. The conversation ended badly. The next morning my father called. Martin had always been easier to talk to than my mother because he rarely demanded things directly. Instead, he made compliance sound like the reasonable path available to mature people. Your mother is worried about both of you, he said. She has an interesting way of showing it. Eloan. He sounded tired. Sarah is under a lot of pressure. You've always been the one who could handle more. There was something about hearing that sentence then, after everything, that finally made me understand what it had always meant. It had never been praise. It was an assignment. Sarah could fall apart because Eloan could handle more. Sarah could need help because Eloan could handle more. Sarah could be protected because Eloan could handle being overlooked. Even Graham's burial could come second because, somehow, I was expected to handle that too. Dad, I said, have you asked me once since Graham died how I'm doing? Silence. Not long. Maybe 3 seconds, but long enough. Of course I care how you're doing. That wasn't my question. He tried to redirect. He said grief affected everyone differently. He said Mom was stressed. He said Sarah's business had employees depending on it. He said we should all try not to make permanent decisions while emotions were high. I listened until I couldn't anymore, then told him I needed to go. That weekend Sarah came to my house uninvited. She stood on my porch holding a folder full of floor plans. Not rough sketches, detailed plans, measurements, photos, notes about where display racks could go and which wall might be removed to open up the front retail area. I stared at the pages. Where did you get these? Sarah's expression changed for half a second. Mom had some information? What information? Helloan, don't make this weird. How do you know the dimensions of the back storage room? She looked away. That was when the grief fog in my head cleared just enough for suspicion to get through. I had never shown Sarah detailed plans of Graham's building. I had never discussed the storage area with my mother. You've been planning this, I said. Not planning. Considering. Since when? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. She shoved the papers back into the folder. You know this was always supposed to be an option for me. I stared at her. According to who? Sarah hesitated. Then frustration took over. Mom said it had been discussed. With me? With Graham. The room seemed to get quieter. Graham never told me that. Sarah rolled her eyes. And then she said the sentence that changed the entire shape of what I thought was happening. Well, Graham already made this difficult enough when he was here. She stopped the second the words left her mouth. I didn't. I just looked at her and realized my husband had been involved in a family argument about his own property, and somehow I was the only person who had never known it existed. The worst part about discovering that my husband had kept something from me was that I couldn't ask him why. After Sarah left, I stood in the entryway for a long time, staring at the closed door and replaying her words. Graham already made this difficult enough when he was here. I tried to imagine the conversation she was referring to. Graham sitting across from my mother. Sarah talking about the boutique. Someone bringing up the building. Graham saying no. None of it fit with the version of events my family had given me, because according to them, moving Sarah into Graham's property was a brand new idea born from a sudden financial problem. Now I knew at least part of that was a lie. I called my mother that evening. Did you talk to Graham about letting Sarah use the building? There was a pause just long enough to answer the question before Celeste said anything. We talked about lots of things. That wasn't what I asked. Helloan, I honestly don't know why you're interrogating me. I closed my eyes. Graham used to tell me that my mother could turn a direct question into an accusation against the person asking it faster than anyone he had ever met. Sarah showed up here with floor plans, I said. She knew details about the building I never gave her. Then she told me you had discussed it with Graham. Discussed is a very broad word. What did Graham say? Another pause. He had concerns. What concerns? You would have to ask him. The cruelty of that sentence may not have been intentional. That didn't make it hurt less. My mother seemed to realize what she had said, because she immediately softened her voice. Helloan, I didn't mean it like that. I have to go? I ended the call. 2 days later, my cousin Marissa sent me a message asking if I was okay. I almost ignored it because by then I had developed a strange reaction to that question. When people asked how I was doing, I wanted to tell them I had no idea. I slept on Graham's side of the bed because mine felt wrong without him beside it. I still bought 2 coffees if I stopped somewhere in the morning. I had found one of his jackets hanging behind the laundry room door and sat on the floor, holding it for almost an hour. But I knew that wasn't what Marissa was asking. Her next message confirmed it. Your mom says you're making some big decisions because you're angry and maybe not thinking clearly. I read the message twice. What big decisions? I ask. Something about Sarah's store and a building. That was how I discovered my mother had started telling people her version of the story. In Celeste's version, I was a grieving widow who had become unpredictable. Sarah was a struggling small business owner trying to save jobs. My parents were worried about both daughters and desperately trying to keep the family together. The burial barely appeared in the story at all. Over the next week, the messages multiplied. An aunt told me not to make permanent choices while grieving. A family friend reminded me that sisters were supposed to support each other. Someone I had not spoken to in nearly a year sent me a paragraph about forgiveness. I wanted to ask what exactly I was supposed to forgive while everyone was still pretending nothing had happened. Then Sarah started posting online. Nothing direct. She was smarter than that. Just vague statements about how difficult entrepreneurship could be and how painful it was when the people closest to you didn't believe in your dreams. One post ended with, "Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones least willing to support your dreams." Hundreds of people liked it. I stared at the screen and wondered how I had become the villain in a story where my only action had been refusing to hand over my dead husband's property. The final insult came when my mother called to tell me about Sunday dinner. "I think you should sit this one out," she said. I almost laughed. "You're uninviting me from family dinner." "That's not what I said. You just told me not to come." "Everyone needs a little space until you're calmer." There it was. I had been abandoned at Graham's burial, then pressured for his property. Now I was being excluded because my refusal to surrender it made everyone uncomfortable. "Who needs space, Mom?" I asked. "Me or you?" She didn't answer. I hung up and opened the family group chat. My thumb hovered over the delete button. I wanted every message gone. I wanted Sarah's words gone. I wanted to stop seeing my mother's careful non-response beneath them. I wanted to erase the entire week from my phone, even though I knew I could never erase it from my memory. Tamsin was at my house when I finally broke down, not dramatically. I didn't throw anything or scream. I just sat on the kitchen floor because suddenly standing required more energy than I had. "Maybe they're right," I said. "Maybe I am making everything worse because I'm angry." Tamsin crouched beside me. "You are angry." I looked at her. "That doesn't mean you're wrong." I told her I wanted to delete the messages. She took my phone gently from my hand. "Don't." "I don't want to keep reading them." "Then don't read them. But don't erase the evidence just because they're making you ashamed of having it." Evidence? The word sounded too serious for a family argument. Then again, this no longer felt like a family argument. Tamsin helped me export the group chat and save screenshots. Not because we had a revenge plan. We didn't. At that point, I still wanted the whole thing to disappear. But once I started organizing the messages chronologically, something became impossible to ignore. Before Graham's burial, there were dozens of messages about Sarah's grand opening. After the burial, there were almost none asking how I was. Then, suddenly, there were messages about the building. The pattern was so clear when I saw it on a screen that I felt embarrassed for not recognizing it sooner. Graham had recognized it. That thought brought me back to Sarah's comment. I started going through his files. Graham had been annoyingly organized. Digital folders, paper folders, labels that actually made sense. I searched everything related to the building. Property records, renovation estimates, insurance, old leases. Most of it meant nothing. Then I found a slim paper folder labeled Future Use. Inside were several handwritten notes from meetings Graham had taken about possible community projects. One name appeared twice, Adrian Cross. I remembered Adrian from the burial. He had worked with Graham on a neighborhood redevelopment project years earlier. On the back of one page, in Graham's handwriting, was a note that made my stomach tighten. "Talk to Adrian after Celeste asked again, not once, again." Beneath it was a date from 8 months before Graham died. I sat at his desk staring at those 5 words. My mother had been pressuring Graham about something involving that building months before I knew any problem existed. I found Adrian's number in Graham's contacts. For several minutes, I held my phone without calling. Part of me was afraid of what I might learn. Another part was afraid that whatever Graham had been protecting me from had not ended when he died. It had simply lost the person standing between me and my family. Finally, I pressed call. Adrian answered after 3 rings. I told him who I was, although he remembered me immediately. Then I asked him if he knew why Graham had written my mother's name in a file about the property. Adrian went silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "Eloan, I always assumed Graham told you." My grip tightened around the phone. "Told me what?" There was another pause. "About the arrangement your mother wanted him to make for Sarah." I looked down at Graham's handwriting again. Suddenly, Sarah's floor plans, my mother's evasiveness, and those months of unexplained tension between Celeste and my husband began lining up in a way I didn't like. "There was no arrangement," I said. Adrian exhaled slowly. "No," he replied, "because Graham refused it." Adrian's answer should have made me angry, but at first all I felt was tired. There was something exhausting about realizing that even after Graham was gone, I was still discovering ways he had quietly protected me. I asked Adrian to explain everything from the beginning. He hesitated, not because he was hiding anything, but because he clearly understood that he was about to tell a widow something her husband had chosen not to burden her with. About 8 months before Graham died, my mother had approached him about the building. Sarah was already planning Vale and Vine at the time, although she had not signed the lease on her current location. According to Adrian, Celeste had suggested that Graham reserve the ground floor of his property for Sarah, not immediately, not officially. She wanted what she called a family understanding. If Sarah's boutique grew, or if her first location didn't work out, she would have the first option to move into Graham's building on favorable terms. "What does favorable mean?" I asked. Adrian gave a humorless laugh. Graham asked the same question. Apparently, my mother had never given a specific number. She talked about family helping family. She said Sarah needed room to take risks. She reminded Graham that I had a stable career and that he and I were doing well financially. The implication was obvious. We could afford to be generous. Sarah deserved the opportunity. "Why was Graham talking to you about it?" I asked. Adrian explained that Graham had been considering several long-term uses for the building. One idea involved converting the upper floor into affordable shared workspace for independent designers, photographers, and other small businesses. Adrian had experience with community development projects, so Graham sometimes asked his opinion. When Celeste began pushing for Sarah to have priority access, Graham wanted to know whether making that kind of informal commitment could complicate future plans. "He was also worried about you," Adrian said. "Me?" "He didn't want you pressured into giving your sister something you never offered." I had to look away from the phone, even though Adrian couldn't see me. That sentence sounded exactly like Graham. Why didn't he tell me? I can't answer that for him. Adrian paused. But I can tell you what he said to me. He said you had spent most of your life being put in the middle, and he didn't want to hand your mother another reason to do it. I covered my mouth with my hand. Graham had known. Of course he had known. He had watched me spend years negotiating peace between people who rarely worried about whether I was peaceful. He must have thought he could handle Celeste himself and spare me another battle. "What did he tell her?" I asked. "No." Adrian's answer was immediate, politely at first, then very clearly. My mother apparently continued bringing it up, sometimes casually, sometimes through hypothetical questions. What if Sarah needed a temporary space? What if the boutique became successful enough to expand? Wouldn't it be nice to keep the building in the family? Graham refused every version. Then Adrian mentioned an email. I saw part of it because Graham forwarded it to me after she contacted him again. I may still have the thread. My heart started beating faster. "Can you look?" He promised he would. 40 minutes later, an email appeared in my inbox. Adrian had forwarded the message with a short note explaining that it was the only copy he had, I recognized Graham's writing style immediately. Calm, precise, almost painfully polite. The email was addressed to my mother. Graham thanked her for her interest in the property, then wrote that he wanted to avoid any future misunderstanding. He stated clearly that no commitment had been made to reserve any part of the building for Sarah. Any future decision about the property, he wrote, belonged to Eloan and me alone. Then came the line that made me stop breathing for a second. I also don't want Eloan placed in a position where saying no to a business proposal is treated as saying no to her family. I read it again. Then again. Graham had understood exactly what would happen. Maybe not the circumstances. Certainly not that he wouldn't be here. But he knew the mechanism. If Sarah wanted something and I refused, my mother would turn the refusal into a test of loyalty. I leaned back in Graham's desk chair and cried for the first time in several days, not because of the building, not even because of my mother. I cried because my husband had been protecting me in a room I didn't know I needed protection in. A memory came back to me from around the same time as the email. We had been driving home from dinner at my parents' house. Celeste had barely spoken to Graham all evening. At the time, I assumed she was irritated because he had disagreed with her about something political. I apologized for her mood. Graham smiled and told me not to worry about it. "Your mother, and I just see boundaries differently," he said. I had laughed. "You see boundaries. She sees suggestions." He laughed too. Then he reached over and squeezed my hand. I hadn't known how literal that conversation was. The next day, I met Adrian for coffee. I wanted to hear the rest face to face. He told me my mother eventually stopped asking Graham directly, but not because she had accepted his answer. "Your mother didn't accept his no," Adrian said. "She just stopped asking him directly." That explained Sarah. Celeste had gone around Graham and created a different version of reality for my sister. I called Sarah that afternoon, not to argue but to ask one question. "When did Mom tell you the building was an option?" Sarah sounded defensive immediately. "Why? Just answer me." She said Celeste had first mentioned it almost a year earlier, before Sarah signed her current lease. My stomach dropped. "What exactly did she tell you?" "That Graham was being difficult about the details, but eventually you two would come around. She said if my first location didn't work, the family would make sure I had somewhere better." There it was. Sarah had built part of her business plan around a safety net that did not exist. That didn't excuse her entitlement. It didn't erase what she had said about Graham's burial. But for the first time, I understood that my mother had been lying in two directions. To Sarah, she had implied Graham's no was temporary. To me, she had pretended the idea of using the building had only come up after Sarah's financial trouble. And now, to our extended family, she was suggesting Graham himself had wanted to help Sarah. 3 different stories. One purpose. Get me to say yes. That evening, Tamsin came over with takeout. I showed her the email. She read it silently, then set my phone on the table. "What are you going to do?" A week earlier, I would have said I didn't know. I would have started listing all the people I needed to explain myself to. My mother, my father, Sarissa, my aunt, anyone who had received Celeste's version before mine. But I was suddenly exhausted by the idea of chasing a lie from person to person, trying to reach everyone before my mother rewrote the story again. "Nothing," I said. Tamsin raised an eyebrow. "Nothing? I'm not calling anyone. I'm not defending myself to every cousin Mom recruits." I looked at Graham's email again. "I'm done trying to outrun a story my mother keeps rewriting." For the first time since Graham died, I felt something other than grief or anger. I felt clear. My family believed my silence meant I was cornered. They believed enough pressure would eventually turn my no into a yes, because that was what had always happened. What they didn't know was that I now had the group chat. I had the timeline, I had Graham's email, and most importantly, I finally understood what he had been trying to protect me from. I wasn't going to use any of it to attack them. I wasn't going to start a public war, But I also wasn't going to protect their version of the truth anymore. If my mother wanted to keep telling people that Graham had promised Sarah his building, I was going to let her. Because now I had something she didn't know I possessed: Graham's answer. In his own words, and for the first time in my life, I decided I could wait until the truth was needed instead of begging people to believe me before they heard it. The first time I told my mother no without explaining myself, she didn't know what to do with the silence that followed. She called on a Thursday afternoon while I was standing inside Graham's building, surrounded by dusty floors, old shelving, and the kind of possibilities that had once belonged to both of us. "I've been thinking about this," Celeste said, "and I believe we've all let emotions get in the way." I almost smiled. Whenever my mother said we had let emotions get in the way, she usually meant someone else had stopped doing what she wanted. "Sarah has put together a reasonable proposal," she continued. "She can contribute toward utilities, and once the boutique is profitable again, you can revisit the arrangement." "No, Mom," she paused. "You haven't even heard the details." "I don't need to." "Helloan, please don't do this." I looked through the front windows at the afternoon light falling across the empty retail floor. "Do what?" "Turn your grief into something that hurts your sister." A month earlier, that sentence would have sent me into a 20-minute defense of myself. I would have explained that I loved Sarah. I would have insisted I wasn't angry at her success. I would have reminded my mother that I was grieving. Then I would have somehow ended the conversation apologizing for making everyone uncomfortable. "This time," I said, "the answer is no." That's it. That's it. I ended the call. My hands were shaking afterward, which annoyed me. Saying one word to my mother should not have felt like jumping from a moving vehicle. But beneath the anxiety was something unfamiliar. Relief. I had not convinced her. I had not changed her mind. I had simply stopped treating her agreement as a requirement for my decision. The following week, I met with the attorney handling the remaining details of Graham's estate. I brought every document related to the building and asked the question I should have asked before allowing my family to make me feel like I was withholding something that belonged to them. "Does anyone else have any claim to this property?" The attorney shook his head. "No. Ownership transferred according to the estate documents. No one has a right to use, lease, sell, or make decisions about the property unless you authorize it." "Not my mother?" He looked mildly confused. "No. Not my sister?" "No." I laughed quietly. The attorney probably thought I had lost my mind. "Sorry," I said. "I just needed to hear someone say it plainly." He leaned back in his chair. Then plainly, "No one has any claim to the building unless you choose to give them one." I carried that sentence with me when I returned to the property. For weeks, I had thought of the building as the object destroying what remained of my family. Standing there alone, I realized that was backwards. The building hadn't created anything. It had exposed something. I walked upstairs to the open studio floor. Dust floated in the light from the tall windows. Graham had loved this space. Years earlier, when he first showed it to me, he had spread his arms and said, "Imagine what people could build here if they could actually afford to get started." At the time, we joked about turning it into everything from art studios to a co-working space. Life got busy. Other projects came first. The idea stayed an idea. Until now. I called Adrian. We met at the building 2 days later with Tamsin. Adrian walked slowly through the upstairs rooms, talking about the project Graham had once described to him: small private studios, shared meeting rooms, flexible leases, affordable space for people starting businesses who weren't ready for expensive commercial rent. The ground floor could hold 2 small retail units and a shared workshop or event area. He wanted this place to help people build something, Adrian said. He looked around. Not hand someone a shortcut. The words stayed with me. I didn't want to turn the building into a monument to Graham. He would have hated that. But I could finish something we had once imagined together. So I started planning. For the first time since his death, I used my professional skills on something that felt personal in a good way. I measured rooms, reviewed renovation costs, contacted contractors. I drew layouts late at night at the kitchen table where Graham used to sit across from me. Sometimes the grief came so suddenly I had to stop. But now, when I stopped, I eventually started again. My family knew none of this. As far as Celeste was concerned, I was leaving the building empty out of spite. She told that version to anyone willing to listen. An aunt called and said, "Your mother says you'd rather let the place sit unused than help your sister." I almost corrected her. Instead, I said, "That's interesting. Is it true?" "No." "Then what are you doing with it?" I looked at the plans spread across my desk. "Something else." That was all I gave her. I had finally learned that information was not something my family automatically deserved. Meanwhile, Sarah's pressure increased. She sent projections showing how much money she could save. She offered to let me invest in the boutique in exchange for a percentage. When I declined, she accused me of wanting her to fail. I answered with one sentence. "Your business is not my responsibility." She didn't respond for 2 days. Then my mother called again. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail lasted 4 minutes. I listened to 11 seconds before deleting it. Tamsin found this hilarious. "Look at you," she said, reckless. "I know. Next week I might ignore a group text. Slow down. We don't want you becoming dangerous." For the first time in weeks, I laughed without feeling guilty afterward. We still kept records. Tamsin helped me organize everything into a folder on my laptop. The group chat containing Sarah's trivial event message, screenshots showing my mother's response, the timeline of calls after Graham's burial, the first request about the building, Sarah's floor plans, Graham's email rejecting Celeste's proposal. I stared at the folder one evening and said, "This feels like ammunition." Tamsin shook her head. "Only if you plan to shoot first." "I don't." "Then it's not ammunition. It's the truth." I renamed the folder simply Timeline. I didn't know if I would ever show it to anyone. Maybe I wouldn't need to. Maybe my family would eventually lose interest when they realized I wasn't changing my mind. I should have known Celeste better. When private pressure failed, she changed tactics. The invitation came on a Monday. My mother called and spoke in the warm, careful voice she used when she wanted to pretend the previous argument had never happened. She was hosting a family gathering the following Sunday. Aunts, uncles, cousins, Sarah would be there. "I think we've all had enough conflict," she said. "Come to dinner. Let's put all this behind us." I nearly said no. Then she added, "We can settle this as a family." That sentence told me exactly what the dinner was. I called Tamsin. "It's an ambush," she said immediately. "Probably. Are you going?" I looked at the timeline folder on my laptop. Then I looked at the renovation plans beside it. My mother still believed the building was empty. She still believed Graham had never left behind anything that could contradict her. Most of all, she still believed that if she put enough relatives in one room, I would become the old Aloan again, the one who apologized first, the one who surrendered to keep everyone comfortable. "Yes," I said. "I'm going." "Why?" I thought about the 3 empty chairs at Graham's burial. I thought about my mother telling people he had wanted Sarah to have the building. I thought about the email sitting quietly on my computer. Because I'm tired of being discussed in rooms I'm not allowed into. Before Sunday, I printed Graham's email. I saved the screenshots to my phone. I put the timeline in order. I still wasn't planning to expose anyone. If Celeste genuinely wanted peace, I would eat dinner, decline the building request one final time, and leave. But if she wanted to put me on trial in front of the family, I was done arriving without the truth. On Sunday afternoon, I parked outside my parents' house and sat in my car for a full minute before getting out. Through the windows, I could already see relatives gathered inside. My phone buzzed. A message from Tamsin. "Remember, you don't owe anyone a performance." I put the phone in my bag beside the printed email. Then I walked toward the house where, for most of my life, I had learned that keeping the peace meant keeping quiet. This time, I had no intention of starting a fight, but I was finally prepared to finish one. The moment I walked into my parents' house, I knew my mother had already told everyone why I was there. Nobody said anything directly. They didn't have to. I could tell by the way conversations paused for half a second when I entered the living room, then restarted with too much enthusiasm. I could tell by the relatives who hugged me tightly and the ones who gave me careful smiles without quite meeting my eyes. My cousin Marissa was standing near the dining room. She looked like she wanted to say something, but my mother appeared before she had the chance. "Helloan." Celeste hugged me, as if we had not spent the last several weeks fighting over my dead husband's property. "I'm so glad you came. You invited me." Her smile tightened slightly. "Of course I did. You're my daughter." The word daughter landed strangely. Apparently I was still her daughter. I just wasn't welcome at family dinner when my refusal made everyone uncomfortable. I looked around. Sarah was sitting beside my father, talking to one of our uncles. She wore a polished smile, but the moment she saw me, her expression changed. Not guilt, not embarrassment. Expectation. She genuinely believed this dinner was going to end with me changing my mind. My father stood and hugged me. "Thanks for coming, Ellie." I hated how relieved he sounded, as if my presence alone meant I had agreed to play my old role again. "I'm here," I said. That was all I promised. Dinner itself was almost normal. That was what made it so uncomfortable. People talked about work, vacations, children, and neighborhood gossip. My mother asked if anyone wanted more potatoes. My aunt complained about her new neighbors. Sarah described a new product line she wanted to carry at Vale and Vine. For nearly an hour, nobody mentioned Graham, the building, or the fact that half the people at the table had recently received some version of the story about my supposed emotional instability. I started to wonder if I had misjudged the situation. Maybe my mother really did want a normal family dinner. Then dessert arrived. Celeste waited until everyone had coffee before setting down her cup and saying, "Since we're all together, I think there's something we should address." Tamsin had been right. I looked at my father. He stared into his coffee. He knew. Of course he knew. My mother continued. "The last few months have been difficult for everyone, especially Eloan." I felt my shoulders tighten. "Mom," she held up one hand. "Please, let me finish." Around the table, conversation stopped. "Grief can make people forget who has always been there for them," she said. The sentence was so perfectly constructed that for a moment I almost admired it. She had turned my husband's death into evidence against me. "Celeste," my aunt murmured, but my mother kept going. "I'm not blaming Eloan. I think we all understand. She has been through something terrible. But this family has always believed in supporting each other, and lately that has become difficult." Sarah lowered her eyes. It was a performance I recognized from childhood. Whenever she was at the center of a conflict, she became very quiet and let my mother explain how much she was suffering. "What exactly are we addressing?" I asked. My mother looked at me as though I had forced her to say it. "Sarah's business." There it was. "Her boutique is struggling," Celeste continued. "People's jobs depend on it. She has invested everything she has. Your father and I have invested too. There is a solution available, but unfortunately, emotions have prevented us from discussing it reasonably." My uncle glanced at me. "The building?" he asked. I looked at my mother. So she had told them even more than I realized. Sarah finally spoke. "I never wanted this to become a family fight." I nearly asked her, who had brought the floor plans to my house, but I stopped myself. "Let them talk. All I'm asking for is a chance," she said. "The new location could save the business. I'm not asking Eloan to give me the building." "No," I said. "You're asking me to let you use it for almost nothing." Sarah's face flushed, temporarily. "For how long?" "Until the business stabilizes. 3 months. A year. 5 years. Why does everything have to be a negotiation with you? I almost laughed. Because you're asking to use commercial property. My mother stepped in. This is exactly what I mean. You're reducing family to contracts and numbers. You're reducing my property to something Sarah should get, because she needs it. The room became very quiet. My father finally looked at me. Ellie, nobody is trying to take anything from you. Then my no should have ended this conversation weeks ago. He rubbed his forehead. Can't you just help your sister so we can put all of this behind us? That hurt more than I expected, not because I was surprised, but because some part of me had still hoped my father would eventually find the courage to say something different. Dad, you're asking me to give in so everyone else can stop feeling uncomfortable. Or I'm asking you to think about the family. My mother leaned forward. Exactly. She looked around the table before turning back to me. Sarah has employees who could lose their jobs. She has commitments. All you have to do is say yes. All you have to do, as if my answer were the only obstacle between Sarah and success, as if her lease, her expenses, her business decisions, and my parents' investments had somehow become my responsibility. No, I said. Sarah stared at me. You really want me to lose everything? I want you to stop pretending that I control whether your business succeeds. You have the solution. I have a building that you're not even using. I almost told her about the renovation, about the contractors, about the shared workspace, but I stopped. They didn't need to know yet. My mother shook her head sadly. This isn't you, Eloan. I felt something inside me settle. Maybe you never knew me when I wasn't saying yes. A few people shifted in their chairs. My mother's face hardened. The warm, concerned, parent performance was beginning to crack. Graham would hate seeing you like this. Every muscle in my body went still. My father whispered, Celeste. But she continued. He understood how important family was. He understood that the building could help Sarah someday. I looked directly at her. What did you just say? My mother hesitated, only briefly. Then she committed to it. Graham himself understood this building was supposed to help Sarah someday. Across the table, Sarah nodded. My father looked uncertain. That was when I knew my mother had finally stepped exactly where I needed her to step. Until that moment, I could have left. I could have let everyone believe whatever version made them comfortable. But Celeste had just used my husband, in front of an entire room, to support a claim he had explicitly rejected while he was alive. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. My mother's expression changed. What are you doing? You said Graham understood the building was supposed to help Sarah. He did. Okay. I unlocked my phone. Then, before we talk about what Graham wanted, I think everyone here should understand what this family thought Graham deserved. Sarah frowned. What does that mean? I opened the folder Tamsin and I had saved. My thumb hovered over the first screenshot. I could feel every person at the table watching me. My mother's confidence had not disappeared yet, but I saw the first flicker of concern in her eyes. She didn't know what I had. I turned the screen toward the people sitting closest to me. This is our family group chat from the week Graham died, I said. Nobody spoke. I scrolled to the message I had spent weeks trying not to remember. The one sentence that had followed me from the burial to every conversation about family loyalty since. Then I placed my phone on the table. Sarah's own words were visible on the screen. We can't rearrange everything over one trivial event. My cousin Marissa read it first. Her face changed immediately. Then my aunt leaned closer. My father closed his eyes. For the first time that evening, my mother had nothing prepared to say. And I hadn't even shown them Graham's email yet. Nobody at the table spoke for several seconds. It was the kind of silence that only happens when a room full of people realizes they have been missing an important piece of a story. My aunt was the first person to reach for my phone. She didn't pick it up. She just leaned closer and read Sarah's message again. Trivial event, she asked quietly. Sarah's face went red. That's being taken completely out of context. I looked at her. Then give them the context. I was stressed. I know. The opening had been planned for months. I know that too. She looked around the table as if someone might rescue her. My mother tried. Nobody is proud of every word they say during a difficult moment. Mum, I said. You were in the conversation. Celeste's expression tightened. I scrolled down and showed the messages that followed. Her own response was there. Let's all calm down. Nothing telling Sarah she had crossed a line. Nothing saying Graham's burial mattered. Nothing saying my family would be there. My father's silence was visible too, represented by the complete absence of any response at all. We thought the date could be changed, Celeste said. Graham's brother had flown in. I replied. His closest friends had made arrangements. The burial was scheduled. You knew that. And Sarah had people traveling too. My cousin Marissa looked at my mother. For a store opening. Celeste turned toward her. It was more complicated than that. Was it? I asked. I had spent weeks imagining this moment, although I had never planned for it to happen. In some versions, I thought I would be furious. In others, I pictured myself crying. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Maybe because I wasn't trying to convince them anymore. I was simply showing them what had happened. As the part I think everyone should understand, I said. I opened the timeline I had saved. Graham died on a Tuesday. His burial was Saturday. My parents and Sarah went to the boutique opening. I scrolled. For the next 2 weeks, none of them came to my house. My father shifted in his chair. Ellie, please let me finish. You all had your chance. He stopped. Then Mom called me. I looked around the table. Does anyone want to guess what she wanted to talk about? Nobody answered. Graham's building. My aunt looked from me to Celeste. That was the first conversation. Not exactly, my mother said quickly. I asked how she was. For less than a minute. Helloan, this is ridiculous. You're timing conversations now? No. I'm remembering them. I showed the dates of the calls and messages. Then Sarah's proposal. Then the floor plans she had brought to my house. The pattern was simple enough that I didn't need to explain it. They had not been there when I buried Graham. They returned when something Graham owned became useful. Marissa shook her head slowly. I didn't know any of this. Most of you didn't, I said. Because you heard that I was grieving, angry, and trying to punish my sister. My mother crossed her arms. You are angry. Yes. I looked directly at her. I am. That seemed to surprise her. For years, I had treated anger like evidence that I was wrong. Now I understood I could be angry and still tell the truth. Sarah pushed her chair back slightly. None of this changes the fact that the building was discussed before Graham died. There it was, the second door opening. You're right, I said. Sarah looked relieved for half a second. Thank you. It was discussed. My mother suddenly became very still. I reached into my bag. Just not the way you were told. I took out the printed email. Sarah frowned. What is that? An email Graham sent to Mom 8 months before he died. Celeste spoke immediately. Private emails have nothing to do with this. My aunt looked at her. You just said Graham wanted Sarah to use the building. I unfolded the paper. That's why it has everything to do with this. I didn't read the entire email aloud. I didn't need to. I read the relevant lines. No commitment had been made to reserve any portion of the property for Sarah. Any decision regarding the building belonged to Graham and me. Then I read the sentence that mattered most. I also don't want Eloan placed in a position where saying no to a business proposal is treated as saying no to her family. When I finished, nobody moved. Sarah looked at my mother. You told me he agreed in principle. Celeste shook her head. I said he was open to discussing possibilities. No, you didn't. Sarah's voice changed. For the first time that night, she sounded less angry at me than confused by our mother. You said he was being difficult about the details, but that Eloan would eventually agree. My father turned to Celeste. Is that true? Martin, don't start. Did Graham tell you no? She looked around the table, realizing the room was no longer arranged the way she expected. Graham was stubborn, she said. He never understood how this family works. I almost smiled. There it was. Finally, the truth beneath every other version. No, I said. He understood exactly how this family works. Celeste looked at me sharply. He turned you against us. Graham didn't make you miss his burial. She flinched. I didn't write Sarah's message. He didn't stop Dad from speaking up. He didn't make you tell people I was unstable because I wouldn't give Sarah what she wanted. I never said unstable. You said I wasn't thinking clearly because of grief. Because you weren't. My aunt interrupted. Celeste, stop. My mother stared at her. I had never heard anyone in the family speak to Celeste that way. She just lost her husband. My aunt continued. And you were telling us she was tearing the family apart because she wouldn't hand over his property. That is not what happened. But the problem for my mother was that the room now contained evidence. Her greatest strength had always been controlling the order in which people learned things. She could tell her version first, assign everyone a role, and make any disagreement sound like disruption. That power disappeared once everyone could see the messages for themselves. Sarah looked at me. So you knew Mom had promised me this? No. I found out after you came to my house with the floor plans. I signed my lease thinking I had a backup option. I didn't know that. She looked back at Celeste. You told me the family would make sure I had somewhere. My mother's voice softened. Because I believed your sister would help you. That sentence landed harder than anything else she had said. Celeste had promised away something that was never hers because she had assumed my compliance was guaranteed. My future yes had been treated like family property. There, I said quietly. That's the whole problem. My mother looked at me. What? You made a promise using something that belonged to me, because you never imagined I would be allowed to say no. Or loud. She laughed bitterly. Listen to yourself. Nobody controls you. Then why are we all sitting here discussing what I should do with my building? She had no answer. Sarah did. Because my business could fail. For the first time, I looked at my sister without seeing only the woman who had called Graham's burial trivial. I saw someone who had been protected so completely that she genuinely believed another person's boundary was an attack. I don't want your business to fail, I said. But I'm not responsible for saving it. Her eyes filled with tears. You could. That doesn't mean I have to. My father looked down at the table. My mother shook her head. So that's it. You're going to let your sister lose everything just to prove a point. No. I folded Graham's email carefully. The building isn't sitting empty. Everyone looked at me. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I'm renovating it. My mother stared. For what? Shared workspace. Small studios. Flexible commercial units. Affordable leases for people starting businesses. Sarah laughed once, but there was no humor in it. So strangers get the building, but I don't. They get the opportunity to rent space under the same clear terms as everyone else. Nobody gets promised my property because they share my last name. Celeste stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. You planned all of this to humiliate us. I stood too. No, Mom. I planned a future for something Graham left me. You planned this dinner. She opened her mouth, but I wasn't finished. If Graham's burial was too trivial for you to show up, then what he left behind is too trivial for you to claim. Nobody spoke. I picked up my phone and put the email back in my bag. My mother's face had gone pale with anger. Sarah was staring at the table. My father looked older than he had when I walked in. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. There was a difference. I walked toward the front door. Behind me, my mother called my name, but I kept going outside. The evening air felt cold against my face. I had almost reached my car when I heard the door open behind me. Ollie, wait. My father. I stopped but didn't turn around immediately. He came down the steps slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. I finally faced him. His eyes were wet. I should have said something, at the burial. Before that, tonight, 100 times. I waited. "I thought staying quiet kept the family together," he said. "No, Dad." My voice was softer than I expected. "Staying quiet kept Mom comfortable." He looked down. "I know that now. For most of my life, that admission would have been enough to make me hug him, forgive him, and promise we could fix everything. But something had changed. I loved my father. I also finally understood that loving someone did not erase what their silence had cost me. I opened my car door. "Then you should understand why I'm done listening." His face fell. I got into the car and drove away. I didn't know whether I had just left one family dinner or the entire version of family I had spent 32 years trying to preserve. But, for the first time, the possibility of losing them frightened me less than the possibility of going back. The strangest thing about walking away from my family was how quiet my life became afterward. For the first few days, I kept expecting my phone to ring every hour. I expected my mother to leave long voicemails explaining why I had misunderstood everything. I expected Sarah to send messages accusing me of ruining her life. I expected relatives to tell me I had gone too far. Some of that happened, but not as much as I expected. The truth had changed something. Celeste could still tell her version of events, but now too many people had seen the original messages. They had read Sarah's words. They knew when my family had returned to my life and what they had wanted. Most importantly, they knew Graham had already refused my mother's plan while he was alive. My mother called 11 times during the first week. I didn't answer. She left 4 voicemails. I listened to the first one. It began with, "I hope you're satisfied with what you've done to this family." I deleted it before she finished the second sentence. Sarah sent one message. "I hope someday you understand what this has cost me." I stared at it for a while before putting my phone down. I didn't respond. Maybe one day Sarah would understand what her choices had cost me. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, I was finally learning that understanding was not something I could force out of another person. My father was different. Martin waited almost 2 weeks before contacting me. Then one Saturday morning, he appeared at my door. I nearly didn't let him in. He stood on the porch holding 2 coffees, one with oat milk because he remembered how I took mine. That small detail almost broke me. Grief is strange that way. Sometimes the person who failed you can still remember your coffee order, and both things can be true at once. We sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I had taken my mother's first call about Graham's building. Dad looked around the room as if he expected Graham to walk in at any moment. "I should have come here sooner," he said. "Yes," he nodded. I didn't rescue him from the silence. "I should have been at the burial." "Yes," his eyes filled. "I told myself your mother needed me at Sarah's opening. I told myself you had Tamsin and Graham's family. I told myself you were strong." I looked at him. "Everyone always says that like it means I don't need anyone." "I know. Do you?" He looked down at his hands. "I'm starting to." Dad admitted something I had never expected him to say. He said he had spent most of his marriage avoiding conflict with Celeste because agreeing with her was easier than challenging her. Whenever Sarah needed something, and I resisted, he knew exactly what would happen. My mother would push. I would eventually give in. Peace would return. "I thought staying quiet kept the family together," he said. I remembered his words outside the family dinner. "It kept Mom comfortable," I said. "I know." For once, he didn't defend her. He didn't tell me she meant well. He didn't ask me to call her. That mattered. But it wasn't enough to erase 32 years. "I need you to understand something," I said. "If you want a relationship with me, it has to be yours." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You can have a relationship with me, or you can manage Mom's relationship with me. You can't do both." He understood. No carrying messages, no updates about how hurt Celeste was. No invitations designed to force reconciliation. No telling me what I needed to do to restore the family. If he wanted to be my father, he had to show up as my father, not as my mother's representative. He agreed. I didn't know whether he would succeed, but for the first time, I decided I could let someone prove they had changed instead of doing the work of believing it for them. My relationship with Sarah disappeared almost completely. Without Graham's building as a safety net, she had to make decisions she had spent months avoiding. Vale and Vine didn't collapse overnight. There was no dramatic bankruptcy or public downfall. Real consequences are usually less theatrical. Sarah reduced her staff. She negotiated an early exit from her expensive lease and moved the boutique into a smaller location. She cut product lines that weren't selling. She started working more hours herself instead of hiring people to handle everything she disliked. I heard most of this through Marissa, who occasionally asked if I wanted updates. Usually, I said no. One thing she told me stayed with me, though. Apparently, Sarah had admitted that our mother had convinced her the building would always be available. She had made business decisions believing that if things went wrong, someone would catch her. For the first time in her life, Sarah had a problem no one else solved for her. I didn't enjoy that. But I didn't prevent it either. There was a time when I would have confused those two things. Celeste struggled more with losing control of the story than with losing access to me. Some relatives distanced themselves from her after the dinner. Others stayed close. I didn't ask anyone to choose sides. A few people apologized to me privately. My aunt told me she was ashamed that she had accepted my mother's version without calling me first. Marissa apologized too. I appreciated it, but I didn't pretend one apology repaired everything. Boundaries, I learned, were not punishments. They were information. They told people what access to me required. Meanwhile, the building changed. So did I. Renovation took months. There were delays, budget problems, permits, and one contractor who seemed personally offended by deadlines. I loved almost every minute of it. I turned the upper floor into 6 small studios and a shared conference room. The ground floor became 2 flexible retail spaces and a larger multi-purpose area people could rent for workshops or pop-up events. We kept the rents reasonable, not free. Reasonable. There was a difference Graham would have appreciated. On opening day, I arrived early. I walked through the building alone before anyone else came. The floors had been refinished. Morning light filled the studios. Someone had already placed a small plant on a windowsill upstairs. For 1 second, I could almost hear Graham teasing me about how many times I had changed the lighting plan. "You would have hated the 3rd version," I whispered. Then I smiled. You would have been right. People started arriving around 10. Tamsin came first, carrying pastries and pretending she had not cried in the parking lot. Adrian arrived next. Then came friends, former co-workers of Graham's, and some of the people who had shown up when my life had fallen apart without asking what they would get in return. I stood in the middle of the ground floor watching them talk and laugh, and suddenly I remembered the 3 empty chairs at Graham's burial. For months, those chairs had represented everything I thought I had lost: my husband, my family, my place in the world I had always known. But standing in that building, I finally understood something. Graham was the person I had lost. My family had made a choice. Those were not the same thing. The people who had abandoned me had spent years teaching me that family meant obligation. Graham had taught me something else. Family was the person who noticed when you were carrying too much. The friend who sat on your kitchen floor without asking you to stop crying. The man who drove 3 hours to attend a burial because someone he respected mattered to him. Even my father, if he continued doing the work, might someday become part of that definition again. But nobody was entitled to the word simply because we shared blood. Late that afternoon, after most people had left, I stood near the front windows with Tamsin. "You okay?" she asked. I looked around the building. "I think so." My phone buzzed in my bag. For a moment, I wondered if it was my mother. I didn't check. I didn't need to. There had been a time when every call from Celeste could change the direction of my entire day. Now it was simply a phone ringing somewhere behind me. I thought about the sentence Sarah had written months earlier. One trivial event. They had called my husband's burial trivial because they believed I would eventually absorb the hurt the way I always had. They believed I would forgive first, explain away their behavior, and return to my assigned place as the strong daughter who could handle more. They were wrong. I never destroyed Sarah's business. I never took revenge on my mother. I never demanded that relatives turn against them. I simply stopped solving problems that were never mine and stopped protecting people from the truth about their own choices. That was enough. They called my husband's burial a trivial event. That was the day I finally stopped treating their approval like something sacred. And somewhere between those 3 empty chairs and the room full of people standing beside me now, I stopped calling people family because of who they were supposed to be. I started saving that word for the people who actually showed up. Months later, I realized healing did not arrive as one dramatic moment. It came quietly. It came the first time I drove past my parents' neighborhood without wondering whether I should stop. It came when I made a decision about the building without imagining how my mother would react. It came when my father called just to ask how I was doing and, for once, did not mention Celeste or Sarah. He was learning, slowly, that having a relationship with me meant showing up without asking me to repair the relationships he had helped damage. I was learning that forgiveness and access were not the same thing. I could let go of anger without reopening every door. Sarah's boutique survived in its smaller location. From what I heard, she became more careful with money and more involved in the daily work. We still did not speak, but I found myself hoping she succeeded. Not because I planned to rescue her if she failed, but because I hoped she would finally discover what she was capable of without someone constantly preparing a safety net beneath her. Celeste never gave me the apology I once thought I needed. For a long time, that bothered me. Eventually, I understood that waiting for her to admit everything was just another way of allowing her choices to control my peace. So I stopped waiting. The shared workspace gradually filled with people building things of their own. A graphic designer took one studio upstairs. 2 friends launching a small stationery company rented another. The retail units downstairs changed with pop-ups and new businesses. Every time I walked through those doors, I thought about Graham. Not with the sharp pain I had felt in the beginning, but with gratitude. He had left me a building, yes. But the more important thing he left me was the memory of someone who had loved me without requiring me to earn it. For most of my life, I thought being family meant staying no matter how people treated you. Now I think it means something much simpler. Family is who shows up. Family is who respects your no as much as your yes. Family is who can see your pain without immediately asking what you can still do for them. My revenge was never watching my family suffer. It was realizing I no longer had to suffer to keep them comfortable. They called my husband's burial a trivial event, and for a while I thought that day had taken my family away from me too. I was wrong. It simply showed me the difference between the people who shared my blood and the people who truly shared my life. Sometimes karma isn't watching the people who hurt you lose everything. Sometimes it's watching yourself finally build a life where they no longer have the power to take anything from you. And if the people you called family abandoned you when you needed them most, then came back only when they needed something from you, would you give them another chance, or would you finally walk away?